Hello. Welcome back to my channel. I'm Emily, and I know the month is nearing the end, but today we're going to go through all my September spreads in my reading journal, set up my September stats pages, and set up my October intro page. My first read of September was one of my favorites of the year, and because I loved this book so much and it had so much great imagery, I decided I wanted to do a double page spread. I generally keep my book spreads to one page, but I'm finding myself wanting to be a bit more artistic and less structured with the books I really love. I used to do fully artistic pages without really any structure years ago, and I couldn't keep it up because it took so much time to do them. But I sometimes miss having that freedom when I read a book that I really love or has a lot of beautiful imagery or I feel really emotional about. So, with that being said, my first book in September was The Jasad Crown by Sarah Hashem, which is the sequel to The Jasad Heir. There is a lot of silver and gold imagery in this book, so in addition to tying in the cover like I usually do, I wanted to bring that in as well. I picked out some gold metallic scrapbook paper I have, and also some black dot grid paper I have, and drew some gold and silver veining on it using my metallic paint pens. Since this is a double page spread, I wanted to keep my standard setup where I have the cover and list all the info about the book, but I also wanted to have the title in the same style as the cover since I had a little bit more space to play with. I used my black paint pen to do the text for the title to make it as dark and matte as possible, and then used the same silver and gold metallic pens as the veining I did to write the cursive style portions of the title and the author. In addition to printing out the cover, I also found this really gorgeous fan art of the two main characters that I added over the black paper. For all my headings, I used a purple marker to match the cover and tie everything together. I ended up giving this book 5 stars, probably as expected from how much effort I put into this page. My one minor critique of this book after sitting with it for a few weeks is that the magic system and world building is a bit hand-wavy and loose, but it is a lot more defined than almost any other romantasy book I've read, and I can see why the world building elements had to be more limited to really make sure the romance was developed fully, so I was able to accept it even though this one element wasn't absolutely perfect. This is where I would typically read my quotes, but these quotes are very much spoilers for the first book, so I'm not going to read them out, but feel free to pause and read them if you're really super curious. Moving along, the next book I finished was The Salt Grows Heavy by Cassandra Khaw, which is a horror book that is kind of based on fairy tales and horror classics. The villains and main plot of this book are pretty revolved around anatomy and doctors and medical experimentation. So for my background paper, I used this scrapbook paper I have that is like anatomy medical journal notes. I also used this gothic lace PET tape to bring in a bit of the whimsical and romantic vibes since the tone of this book, while being very horror-driven, does also revolve pretty solidly around the romance that develops between the two main characters. For the headers here, I went with a standard print font in a red color to match the cover of the book. I thought this book was good but not great, and I found I enjoyed the last 30 to 40% significantly more than the first 60-ish%. I really adored the romance that developed between our two main characters, and I generally enjoyed the themes of indoctrination that were explored in this book, but I think perhaps this author is just not for me because I also didn't like the other book I've read that was written by this author. I find their writing style is generally very over the top and somewhat distracts from the elements of the story that I actually quite enjoy. And they also always end up focusing on what I care about the least for the majority of the story, and ultimately fail at making me care about what they're focusing on instead of what I wish they were focusing on. I ended up giving this one 3 stars. And the quote I wrote down was, "Bury me, my love, and take a lock of my hair with you. Carry me through the centuries. I think I'd like to share just a little in what immortality is like." Next up was The Possession of Alba Diaz by Isabel Cañas, which is a horror novel that follows a young woman when she goes to an isolated town operating a silver mine with her fiancé and her family, but strange things begin happening to her the longer she stays. For the stationery, the largest paper I used is the dark black and red, very gothic paper. All of Isabel Cañas's books are solidly in the gothic genre and blend romance and horror together seamlessly. I also used this silver metallic paper to fit the silver mine setting and a map because the MMC of this book is a big traveler, and one of the things that Alba and him bond over is wanting to leave the town they're in and travel the world together. For all the headings, I used a maroon dark pink kind of color. I loved this book just like I love all of Isabel Cañas's books. I think she's just truly such a master at blending romance and horror together, and I just cannot imagine ever not liking one of her books. The only thing I felt was lacking was both of her previous works had really clearly defined themes that were explored throughout the book, but the themes in this one felt a little bit less defined and more general and abstract. So I felt like I was missing some of that theme exploration that I've come to expect and love from Isabel Cañas. So that was my only minor critique of this book. Everything else about this book was perfection, though, so I ended up giving it 4.5 stars. The quote I wrote down for this book was, "He had shattered enough fragile things to know that he must treat them with care, to pay attention when something caught the light and held his attention fast, when something made him want to be good." The last singular book page for a book that I finished this month is We Have Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson, which is technically defined as a horror book but falls much more in the mystery genre, in my opinion. This book is all about the main characters isolating themselves and being outcast from the society around them, and also has a lot of whimsy and fairy tale adjacent atmosphere. For stationery, I decided to pull out this paper I have that has this old, very fantasy house on it, since almost the entire book takes place in the family home of the main characters. Mushrooms are also fairly important in this book, so I pulled out this mushroom post stamp kind of insert I have, and I also used this little medallion in the bottom left that I found that had two sisters in a garden on it, as I found it felt like the relationship the two sisters in this book have. For the headers, I went with a gray color to really match the cover. I overall enjoyed this book, but it was not at all what I was expecting going into it and was way less horror than I was expecting. I did really enjoy the character work that is done in this book, and I think the atmosphere of this book really added to all the themes, but I found this book was just lacking in the horror and mystery department. I didn't find the mystery very compelling, and like I said, I wouldn't even really consider this book horror at all, and mystery in general isn't my favorite genre. I ended up giving this 3.5 stars, and I wrote down 2 quotes for this book, so those were, "We eat the year away. We eat the spring and the summer and the fall. We wait for something to grow, and then we eat it." And, "Poor strangers, they have so much to be afraid of." Next up, I finally had a spare page to include this book I DNF'd back in the middle of August, which was The Kingdom of Beck by Marie Lu. I contemplated adding decoration to this page as I have done decoration on DNF pages in the past, but I think I've decided I don't really want to waste stationery on a page for a book that I didn't finish. So I just did the headers in a blue similar to the cover. I got this book in a book box a couple years ago, and it is definitely not something I would have picked to read because I'm not generally a fan of historical fiction that fantasizes the lives of real historical figures, which this very much does, as all of the characters in this book are somewhat significant historical figures and are people that actually lived. In addition to that, I just found this book to be unbelievably boring. Pretty much nothing of note had happened either in plot or character development by the time I DNF'd it around 60%. On to the last book pages of the month. This is another double page spread because in August and September I did a reread of the Raven Cycle series. Since it was a reread, I didn't want to re-rate every book as my opinion is tainted since this is my second time reading these, which meant I didn't necessarily need a full page for each book. But I still wanted to capture the reread in my journal somewhere as it's part of my reading journey for the year. So I decided the perfect compromise was to have the whole series included in this double page spread. Most of the stationery I pulled out is academia themed because that's just kind of the aesthetic of this series. There's a lot about history and languages and legends and stuff like that, and one of the MCs keeps a fairly extensive journal of the whole quest of these books. As far as pulling out the colors I wanted to use, I picked the main color that's present on each cover. The Raven Boys has a dark red color, the Dream Thieves is a lighter blue, Blue Lily, Lily Blue has a green color on it, and the Raven King has a darker, more royal blue. So I used all those colors across these two pages to really tie into the cover picture thing that I made for the whole series. The title I did in a similar font to the book covers, and then I accented that with some pretty standard brush lettering. The majority of these pages consist of some quotes from across the 4 books. I did write down some of the data on these books, such as the format, genre, etc., what I usually include, and then I also added my ranking of the books, since that is something that changed pretty significantly from the first time I've read these. Overall, I really loved doing these rereads, and there was so much more I got to pick up on during the rereads than I did in the initial read. And now that I actually remember all the contents of these books, I can actually go read the follow-on trilogy. Even though these pages mostly consist of quotes, I'm not going to read any of the quotes out loud because most of them do contain spoilers for at least the first book in the series, but the contents of most of the books in the series. So if you'd really like to read the quotes I wrote down and you've read these books, feel free again to pause and read the quotes. But otherwise, I'm just going to move on to my September stats pages. As usual, I'm going to make these match in color and theme to the cover page. For the font, I made pretty much all of the headers match the same font style I used on the cover page, which was a pretty standard, slightly swirly, lowercase print kind of font, and I did this using my silver paint pen. As usual with the silver paint pen, it is kind of iffy whether it will show up on camera or not, but I did that for everything except the numerical statistics. I also added a little upside down moon shape in my title between the 2 words to tie a little more into the moth that is on the cover page, which has this same shape kind of floating above it. For the graphs, I ended up using the 5 different paint pens I used on the cover page, which were all these cozy forest autumnal colors. As usual, with whenever I use paint pens for my graphs, this did take quite a while and had a lot of layering and also a lot of pausing the recording and giving the page time to dry a lot so that nothing smudged. I really love how paint pens look when they're all dried down and layered correctly, but boy oh boy do they take so much longer than working with other techniques like markers and stuff like that. I used these same colors for the numerical stat titles. For the actual stat numbers, I colored blocks in with the marker I used for the background of my cover page and just did the actual stats in black. All right, on to the actual statistics for the month. I read 7 books in September, 3 of which were rereads. The books I read this month were comprised of approximately 686,266 words. Those words spanned 2,313 pages and 507 audio minutes. My favorite book this month was The Jasad Crown, and my least favorite that I finished was The Salt Grows Heavy. For format, I read 2 physical, 3 digital, and 2 audio. 3 of the books were young adult, 3 of the books were adult, and 1 of the books was new adult. For diversity and representation, 1 of the books had Latina main characters, 2 of the books had MENA main characters, 4 of the books featured characters with disabilities, 4 of the books had gay characters and Achillean relationships, 1 of the books had a sapphic relationship, 3 of the books had M-spec characters, 1 of the books had characters on the spectrum of asexuality, and 1 of the books had a non-binary main character. As far as genre, I read 3 horror books, 3 fantasy books, and 1 romantasy. For ratings, 3 of the books were rereads, so I didn't give them new ratings. 1 of the books was 3 stars, 1 of the books was 3.5 stars, 1 of the books was 4.5 stars, and 1 of the books was 5 stars, giving me an average rating of exactly 4 for the new reads. For the author breakdown this month, 6 of the books were written by women, and 1 of the books was written by a non binary author. 4 of the books were written by white authors, 3 of which were written by the same author. 1 of the books was written by a Latina author, 1 of the books was written by a MENA author, and 1 of the books was written by a Southeast Asian author. And there you have all my reading stats for September. Before we move into my October setup, here is a quick flip back through all of my September pages. On to my October intro page. Before I actually dive in, I would like to apologize or give warning, I guess, for the quality of the video. The way I had my light adjusted for filming, I think made the video overexposed as I was recording the bulk of this setup all at one time across a few days, and it was at different times during the day. So I didn't readjust the light for it being a different time of day. And so the video is a little overexposed. And so a lot of the marker looks a lot more streaky on camera than it does in person. And the black point is also all messed up. So you can't really see the outlines all the way when the page is colored in, which is kind of weird. But here is a quick photo that is more realistic to how this piece ended up looking in person. Okay, with all that being said, let's get into my October setup. I decided to go ahead and draw in the main outline of the calendar first this month for some reason, which I usually do last, but I did that first before diving into the main art. I obviously had to do something Halloween-esque. As you can probably tell from my genre breakdown, I'm a big horror girly. I went with this double theme and mixed together aspects of a bunch of different inspiration pieces I found. I found this one piece that had a demonesque creature that you could see all the bones through the skin, and I thought it looked really cool, so I incorporated that in. And then I wanted to give the actual woman on the page a somewhat ethereal look, so I made her hair be floating and gave her some pretty long and significant claws. And then one of the aspects of the devil card is that the devil has chained people on the card, typically as kind of an element of controlling humanity and relationships and stuff like that. But I didn't really want to draw that. It seemed like a lot of work to draw two like mini figures. So instead, I added all these different elements that the devil kind of has her hands in and can manipulate at will as a little nod to that element. As far as actually creating this piece, I did the outline with just some basic fine liners, but I was quite conflicted on what colors to use. I ended up going with, I think, a pretty stereotypical color palette for a piece like this, but I haven't really used any of these colors a ton this year, so I think I'm okay with that. I did want to make sure to at least make it feel like the center of her torso was a little more translucent than her face and arms where you can't see her bones. So I used a lighter red for those areas and then blended that into a slightly darker red as you're getting away from the parts where you can see her bones. This distinction isn't super significant, but I feel like it's enough to give the impression of what I was going for, which was great. I did the bones in just a plain gray and then took a very light pink color and went over not only her bones, but the entire torso and arms to tie it all together and give it that slightly transparent look. I also colored in her eye whites using this color as well. I used a pretty chocolatey brown for her hair and didn't really do too much with that. For her horns, I used darker, more pink colors, but still kept it in that same red-pink color palette in 2 different shades. I used one shade for the smoother top of the horns and then a different shade for the ridged sides of the horns. For her eyes, I used a gold color, and the only elements that I kind of strayed from my general color palette for were the little elements that were hanging from the strings. I also went in with my gold paint pen to make the strings pop a little bit more, and then used my silver paint pen for the pentagram behind her head. Instead of using a regular fine liner for the title letters, I used a black paint pen because it does dry down a little differently than a fine liner. It's a little more matte, and I wanted the finish to look slightly different between the letters and the outline. Then the final piece was the background, which I went in with a deeper yellow color across the entire background within the square. After the whole intro page was done, I went back to the calendar page and added the gray lines I do to have different lanes for tracking multiple books at once, and also added in the numbers for the days in a red color to match the cover. And there we have my full October setup. I think it turned out quite well, in person at least. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you again next time.